The desire for conquest is itself a sort of subjugation. George Eliot.
Oh, hi, Mr. Lahasky here, and today we're going to talk about New Spain. Now, this story begins with Christopher Columbus and will witness the meteoric rise of the Spanish Empire in the New World. This story features characters who are familiar, as well as some that are probably lesser known. But at its core, this story is about a collision of two diametric societies, Europeans and Native Americans. And the aftershocks of this collision can be felt even today. So let's get started with a big question. How should we remember Christopher Columbus? For centuries, Christopher Columbus has been regarded as a hero. He's credited with the discovery of America in 1492. His expedition to the New World transformed the global economy and forever changed the balance of power in Europe, touching off the rise and fall of new empires, including, much later, the United States. But recently, Columbus's legacy has been called into question, because along with the positive impacts of his expedition comes a barrage of human tragedy. The arrival of European colonizers resulted in chronic misunderstanding, enslavement, and death for millions of Native American people. Our goal today is not to decide whether or not to erase parts of history from popular memory. Rather, we are called upon to reckon with it. Our first big idea will lay the groundwork for Columbus's infamous 1492 voyage. By the late 1400s, Spain, more so than any other European power, was politically, economically, and socially motivated to explore the Western Hemisphere. You may have heard the old rhyme, Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. And if you were paying attention in your world or European history class, you might also remember that the Spanish Reconquista ended in that same year. This is no coincidence. Spain's successes in reclaiming the Iberian Peninsula from the Moors gave it a new sense of national pride. But Spain was a weak nation-state compared to the other European powers at the time, and it featured an economy that was dilapidated by war. Also contributing to the struggling economy was the fact that Spain was paying very high prices for goods imported from the Far East via the spice trade. Indeed, Spain faced significant political and economic unrest in 1492. But social factors were also weighing on them, namely religion. Remember, the Reconquista was not just about land. It was also about re-establishing Catholicism on the peninsula after 800 years of Muslim rule. Furthermore, the Catholic Church was beginning to come under criticism. We're only a few decades away from a major Reformation movement in Europe. Being a deeply Catholic country, Spain had a vested interest in advancing the agenda of the Pope at home and abroad. And so this is where Christopher Columbus enters our story. Columbus was an Italian sailor who was truly at the right place at the right time. He had long been obsessed with westward exploration and was in search of a benefactor to pay for a voyage. In 1492, the monarchs of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, finally answered the call. And it's not hard to see why the king and queen took a chance on Columbus. If successful, Columbus could alleviate all of Spain's pressing issues. He could potentially improve the economy, either through the discovery of a westerly route to the Spice Islands or by finding other riches along the way. He could potentially bolster Spain's political situation by augmenting her power and reputation by making new discoveries. And he could potentially do important religious work as a bastion of Catholicism in foreign lands. If Columbus failed, Spain would be no worse off than they started. But if he succeeded, he could single-handedly put Spain on a meteoric rise. And by all Spanish accounts, succeed he did. Columbus landed on the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean in October of 1492. He soon learned that he had not reached the East Indies, but a new land yet unknown to Europe. He claimed the island for Spain and began searching for material riches there. Columbus was also among the first Europeans to interact with indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. His diary lends insight into the brand of European racism that would come to define the age of exploration. He reported that the native Taino people were well-formed but, quote, poor in everything, and ignorant to Spanish armament. He saw them as a people that could be converted into Christianity, but also as a people who would make, quote, good and intelligent servants. He kidnapped and enslaved 6 Taino people during his first voyage and returned to Spain to show off his discovery. Heralded as a hero back in Europe, Spain moved quickly to outfit Columbus with increased resources. Ferdinand and Isabella named him governor of Hispaniola and sent him back to the Caribbean with 17 ships. Though he was a brilliant sailor and navigator, Columbus proved a brutal governor. Fighting soon broke out with the Taino, after which Columbus enslaved many of the indigenous people. Some were sent to become servants in Europe, but most were forced to mine for gold on the island. When the Taino failed to produce riches to the Spaniards' satisfaction, they were physically punished, often brutally. Historians estimate that more than 90% of the Taino people on Hispaniola, hundreds of thousands, died from enslavement, massacre, starvation, disease, or suicide during Columbus's rule. Columbus was eventually stripped of his authority, but Pandora's box had been opened. Over the next 150 years, Spain put a full court press on the New World. By 1650, they controlled most of South America, all of Central America, the Caribbean, and Mexico, and did so at the expense of the native populations that stood in their way. Their motivation mirrored the rationale for Columbus's first voyage, and can be summarized with the 3 G's: God, gold, and glory. God represents religious motivation, as Spain wanted to expand the dominion of the Catholic world amid the Reformation. Gold, of course, was economic motivation. Spain became the richest empire in the world thanks to its New World colonies. Spanish conquistadors sent home mineral riches from Central and South America and established plantations for cash crops in the tropical climate of the Caribbean. And glory represented political motivation. Spain's reputation soared as it amassed wealth and power, and the conquistadors and explorers became national heroes. And remember, all of this can be traced to a weak, economically destitute country that took a chance on Christopher Columbus in 1492. We're going to take a closer look now at the inner workings of New Spain, and it brings us to our second big idea. Spain's massive empire was driven by mining, agriculture, and trade, and was dependent on the unfree labor of indigenous peoples. Spain's conquest of Mesoamerica, South America, and the Caribbean was unmitigated. But in order for Spain to profit from its venture, it would need steady sources of income and labor. The economy of New Spain was based on an economic system called mercantilism. In a mercantilist economy, the principal function of a colony is to benefit the mother country, usually by supplying the mother country with raw materials. The colony then depends on the mother country to supply them with finished products. Through this system, Spain's New World colonies quickly made it one of the wealthiest nations in the world. South America and Central America proved to be profitable mining colonies, and tons of gold, silver, and other precious metals were shipped back to Europe. In places where mining was impractical, cash crops like sugar dominated economic activities. But we cannot discuss the economic success of New Spain without acknowledging the brutal reality of the people who were exploited for their labor, the Native Americans. Mining and plantation agriculture are labor-intensive activities, requiring long hours in difficult conditions. The Spanish lacked workers who were willing and able to perform this labor, so they turned quickly to the indigenous populations whose lands they had conquered. The Spanish established a new labor system in the New World known as the encomienda system. In this system, Spaniards forced indigenous peoples to work in their mines and plantations. Laborers were legally tied to the land and subject to the commands and punishments of the Spanish. In return, natives were promised protection and Christianity. Now, if this sounds a little fishy, it was. And if it sounds a little familiar, it should. The encomienda was based on the old model of European feudalism, in which peasants were legally tied to the land they worked and provided their labor in exchange for protection and religion provided by the lords, nobles, and clergymen. The irony of the encomienda, of course, was that the natives neither asked for nor valued Christianity. We learned last week that they already had robust religions of their own. Additionally, after the Spanish invaded and conquered their land, the only people the natives really needed protection from were the Spanish. The Spanish enslaved millions of indigenous people under the guise of the encomienda, and the system was largely responsible for the demise of native populations across their empire. While racism in New Spain began with Columbus's first voyage to Hispaniola and featured prominently in the encomienda system, it's important to note that it was not ubiquitous. And that brings us to our third big idea. Spanish attitudes towards indigenous peoples varied. Most Spaniards held racist views of European superiority, while a few defended the humanity of Native Americans. In the mid-1500s, a Spanish friar inspired debate over the treatment of indigenous people in the New World. His name was Bartolomé de las Casas. Born in the Caribbean of Spanish parents, Las Casas spent his whole life among the Taíno people and took issue with their treatment in the colonies. In 1542, Las Casas wrote a scandalous pamphlet entitled A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies. In gruesome detail, Las Casas described the rape, mutilation, and murder of native people at the hands of their Spanish colonizers. He defended the humanity of the Taíno and called for an end to the encomienda system. His writing appealed to Spain's Catholic sensibilities and even inspired legislation. In 1542, the Spanish government issued the New Laws, which recognized the freedom of indigenous people and mandated that they be paid for their labor. Unfortunately for Las Casas and the enslaved population, the encomienda system was deeply entrenched in the Spanish colonies, and the new laws proved difficult to enforce from Europe. Most of the restrictions were officially abandoned in 1545. But the debate over the treatment of Native Americans endured, and Las Casas continued his crusade against the encomienda. In 1550, he traveled to Valladolid, Spain, to participate in a series of debates over the morality of Native American enslavement, the first such forum to take place in Europe. His opponent was the philosopher Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, who argued that enslavement was a natural condition for the natives who, according to the Spaniard, lacked the hallmark traits of civilized society. Sepúlveda badly misunderstood and mischaracterized indigenous American culture, but his remarks typified a worldview that was common in Spain, and one that would later manifest in the British colonies in North America. Here's a clip from a BBC documentary on the history of racism that discusses the Valladolid debates in greater detail.
In the early 16th century, from Chile in the south to Florida in the north, this non-white other was no more than vermin to be exterminated. The Dominican monk Bartolomé de las Casas was eyewitness to countless atrocities against the native populations. His account reads like a catalogue of genocide.
The mainland in the region known as Florida. The Spaniards murdered many, as is their custom, in order to strike terror into the hearts of these people. They made their lives an utter misery, treating them as so many beasts of burden. In another large town, the butchers put the whole town to the sword, young and old, chiefs and commoners, not even the children were spared. The butcher-in-chief arranged for a large number of natives in the area to have their noses, lips and chins sliced from their faces. They were then sent away in unspeakable agony and all running with blood, to act as walking testimony to the great deeds and holy miracles performed by these dauntless missionaries of the Holy Catholic faith.
The things that Las Casas witnessed, particularly on Hispaniola or in Cuba, these incredible crimes, these incredible attacks on Indians, disembowelings and burnings and rapes and whatever else, I'm sure that that level of violence is something that you could have witnessed in different places in the 17th, the 18th century, in other parts of the Spanish Empire. But it was a peculiarly awful moment that Las Casas saw as the Spanish got to the Americas and tried literally to work the Indians to death.
The reports of Las Casas caused enough unease for the Council of the Indies, the Spanish administrators of the New World, to call a debate at Valladolid in Spain in 1550. The debate concerned not just the mistreatment of Indians, but whether they could be categorized as human at all. In contest with Las Casas, the champion of the native populations, was the Jesuit Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda.
By this time, the Spanish have been in the Americas for about 50 years. And during that time, the brutalities carried out by the conquistadors had reached such heights that it caused some alarm. And out of that context came this particular debate. On the one hand, there was this idea that the Indians had souls, they could be Christianized, and they should be treated not as servants, not as forced laborers, but as people under the protectorate of the Spanish. On the other side of the debate was the idea that perhaps these are not people with souls, perhaps these are people who are natural slaves. And in that context, they could be coerced to produce labor.
What Las Casas wanted to do was to change the policy of the Spanish crown towards the Indians. So paradoxically, he was able to get slavery of Indians banned. That's something which the Spanish crown bans, outlaws. And by 1542, the laws have been changed to ensure that there can no longer be Indian slaves. But Las Casas also suggests that the labor shortfall in America can be made up with black slaves from Africa, which I think he later regretted, later in life.
It's a key moment insofar as the reflection on the system that produces race is there in that debate. The system that produces race, which will produce race over the next 200-300 years, is that colonial system.
The encomienda system eventually faded, but not because of any moral epiphany on the part of the Spanish. Rather, the decimation of Native American populations thanks to the introduction of disease like smallpox, along with indigenous enslavement, eliminated much of the colony's workforce. To replace the dying natives, the Spanish turned to African slavery. And we'll discuss this transition more in depth in a later episode. But one more thing that's worth noting here is the role that race continued to play in New Spain. And this is our final big idea. While intermarriage between Spain and Native Americans did occur, race was the principal factor in ordering Spanish colonial society. One of the hallmark characteristics of New Spain was a rigid social caste system that organized society into 5 classes. One's status was determined by the amount of Spanish blood that a person could claim. At the top of this society were the peninsulares, Spaniards who were born in Spain but had traveled to and lived in the New World. These were the conquistadors and the governors of the Spanish colonies. Directly below the peninsulares were the creoles, or Creoles, people born in the colonies of Spanish parents. Bartolomé de las Casas falls into this category. Now, these two groups enjoyed the most freedoms and privileges in New Spain. They had access to better jobs and were compensated well. As time passed, intermarriage between Spanish and Native Americans became increasingly common. Mestizos, or the children born of these unions, occupied the next rung in the colonial ladder. They were often discriminated against, but having one white parent afforded them a measure of privilege not enjoyed by full-blooded Native Americans. At the bottom of the pyramid, we find enslaved people of African descent. As I mentioned before, African slaves were seen as a replacement for Native American workers, and the institution of African slavery was established in New Spain even before the British colonies made landfall in North America. The Spanish caste system established clear boundaries between classes, and this served an important purpose. The clarity and stability it provided acted as a bulwark against social uprising. The Europeans' position at the top of society discouraged high-ranking colonists from acting on behalf of their oppressed counterparts. And the oppression of the Native Americans and enslaved Africans reinforced the notion of inferiority in those populations. While uprisings did sometimes occur, as in the Pueblo Revolt in 1680, they were rare and often unsuccessful. So, to what extent can we pin the atrocities of New Spain on the shoulders of Christopher Columbus? Certainly, Columbus set the tone for attitudes of European racial superiority that forever characterized the Spanish Empire. He was the first of the conquistadors, and his journals formed a crude blueprint for later conquests. The encomienda system, which enslaved millions and claimed countless lives, mirrored the tribute system that Columbus established as governor of Hispaniola. The collision of European and native societies touched off by Christopher Columbus wiped out generations of people on multiple continents. And for all the good that may have come from his discovery, we must always weigh it against the backdrop of racism and genocide that defined the Spanish Empire in the Americas, and in some ways, the one that has endured today. That's all for now. Next time we'll shift our attention to the English colonies of North America, 13 of which will go on to form a grand experiment in Republican democracy. See you then.